Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
It's never too early to set expectations and goals for your child's education. The UA College Savings Plan provides opportunities that can help you reach your educational savings goals. Save in Alaska. Study anywhere. There is more information available by calling 1-888, the number 4, and then Alaska. This message sponsored by the UA College Savings Plan.
The National Weather Service.
Latest weather information, and there, now that you can hear me, we'll start all over. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with a mic on, and today is the 25th of February. Thanks for joining us for Alaska Weather. You can always get the very latest weather information, mic or not, at weather.gov/Alaska. Just head to arh.noaa.gov. The weather info line, 800-472-0391. Find us on Twitter, on Facebook under U.S. National Weather Service Alaska, and on YouTube. You can even watch that whole mic bit once again later in the evening hours. Go to alaskapublic.org, watch the complete broadcast there, or at the top bar there in the search bar on YouTube, type in AKWX TV, and you'll be able to find the entire show and many others, probably mic'd, as far back in history as they go. Here's a look at hazardous weather now out across the West Coast. Freezing rain advisories are going into effect tonight and into tomorrow for many parts of the West Coast around the lower Yukon, the YK Delta, and the Bering Strait. Looks like most areas you're going to expect less than 1/10 of an inch, so it's not going to be a substantial freezing rain event as it looks at this time. But anything over about 1/10 of an inch could start to impact power lines there, and travel, of course. Any amount of ice could make that a little bit more tricky. So the situation is warm and wet air is coming up over the top of colder, drier air. And as a result of that, the precipitation type may not just be rain or snow, but something in between. Rain falling into that cold air mass could freeze on contact, and that freezing rain is possible then from the YK Delta, the lower Yukon, and again in the Bering Strait as we go into your Wednesday. Now, as we look out across the west, you can see the impacts of the jet stream here blowing in warm and wet air stretching up the coast. We also have another surge of moisture here and convection out across the mid areas of the Pacific. The tropics are a little bit further down south, but this connection here goes a little bit further south than what you can see on the satellite image, but a lot of this being brought in from a healthy dose of southerly winds at many levels of the atmosphere. You'll see the jet stream map here in a moment, and that'll make a little more sense. But you can see that southerly flow fairly strong. Several other areas of low pressure are attached to this overall flow coming on the south side of the Aleutians. You can see another area of low pressure here across the far western reaches of the Bering Sea. And high pressure sitting up across the Arctic coast is keeping things relatively cool there, and the winds will switch around. There was a frontal boundary just kind of lingering right around in here and stretches all the way into the Yukon. Take a look at the map there in the satellite picture, and once again we say this every day, but right now a lot of this low gray color is actually the cold air. What we're really going to focus on is this moisture now that has expanded its reach from what we were talking about a couple days ago. It was a little bit kind of a narrow channel working over Kodiak Island and up the west coast, and now has broadened in its path. Another area of low pressure is working its way into the Gulf, and some of that already really focusing on Kodiak. Tonight, probably dealing with some locally heavy rainfall. That'll continue into tomorrow and then slowly subside as we head into Thursday and maybe Thursday night. But right now you can see that a lot of that moisture is pointed right at Kodiak. For southeast, though, you are still under the influence of high pressure across the Yukon, keeping things very dry across the region. Sure, it's been a little bit breezy at times as that pressure gradient has been kind of tight over your area, and pushed through the Copper River Basin. Some areas of fog this morning have kind of burned off. And out across the west, all that is working that moisture right up the west coast, and with that moisture comes that warmer air, and then the threat of freezing rain for the Bering Strait, the YK Delta, areas around Ammonok, and inland as you head up the lower Yukon Valley. For most of the interior, though, things continue to be pretty dry. Haven't seen a whole lot of cloud cover over Fairbanks the last couple days. There is starting to be a little more cloud cover across the Arctic coast. With areas of low clouds comes the risk of flurries, but nothing too substantial there. There may be a few areas along the west that are dealing with some light snow tonight, but probably nothing more than an inch or two at worst. Here's a look at the weather map there. Here's our frontal boundaries snaking across the Brooks Range and just north of the Bering Strait over the Chukchi Sea coast. Some snow showers around Wainwright this afternoon. A lot of cloud cover beginning to build across the western coast. Snow showers there from Sandpoint and Cold Bay, False Pass in that general vicinity, and low pressure across the Gulf, working to bring in more and more of that Pacific moisture southeast and the interior, south central. Clear as a bell today, and then out across the west, several areas of low pressure lined up there. None of them really attached to any surge of moisture or any major temperature difference, so we don't have any frontal boundaries drawn there tonight. As we head into the evening and overnight hours, again, triple point passing right over Kodiak. That's the point where the cold air, the warm air, and the occlusion all shape up together in this 1, 2, 3 triple point right over Kodiak. Because of that, that's usually where a lot of lift is taking place in the atmosphere. It's usually where a lot of moisture is pointed through. And so all those combinations right there, not to mention the terrain of Kodiak Island itself sticking up out of the water, is focusing a lot of that meteorological energy and coincidence right there on top of Kodiak. So we have a pretty good chance of getting some locally heavy rainfall through the evening and overnight hours and again into Thursday. Now looking up the coast, again, there's an opportunity for some freezing rain. At this point, looks fairly light. There may be some areas farther northward that are dealing with some light snow into Kotzebue Sound. And you can see that warmer air snaking its way up through the Gulf, through the north and eastern Gulf Coast. But a lot of that, maybe all of it, stays out of reach of southeast. So things still looking fairly dry there. We're going to see this frontal boundary kind of shape and reform itself as we head into Wednesday. Several of those waves will kind of fall apart, and then we'll see another surge of warmer air lifting northward. The occlusion stretches well past Nunivak Island and up the YK Delta and southwest. With that comes the opportunity for rain and snow. Probably no snow accumulation with that at this point, more rain than anything else. And there will be some opportunities for more freezing rain as we head through the day on Wednesday. So there will be some snow, but this will eventually change and morph into kind of a warmer precipitation winter type event. So for some areas on the west coast, again, watch for the freezing rain mixed with snow and then eventually becoming rainfall. Rain across the Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island, and snow showers continue for St. Lawrence Island, and probably some freezing rain in there for the central and western chain. Still looking at some snow showers. For southeast, you're dry. Clouds will start to encroach the coastline there, and across the interior, things look pretty nice and sunny as well. For Thursday, high pressure still in charge across the Yukon at 1,024 millibars. Trough of low pressure there across the Alaska Range, and again on the north side of the Brooks Range. That could mean for some gusty winds at times across areas near Fort Greely, perhaps in toward the Tanana Valley, unless the trapping inversions there are set up pretty well. The air moving over there, though, we may see some stronger gusts there into the Yukon Valley, and things may start to push that moisture and snowfall up across the Bering Strait. Low pressure now at 988 millibars south of the Gulf of Anadyr and west of the St. Matthew Island. Waters dragging in a little more dry air across the southwest coast. And there could still be some opportunities for rain and snow around Nunivak Island and some of the YK Delta. Rainfall possible across the Alaska Peninsula, maybe as far west as the eastern chain. We've got a new weather maker, though, coming in from the North Pacific. This is just barely on your map at 952 millibars. The occlusion will likely reach the central and western parts of the chain, or at least graze it there by Thursday night and into Friday. And another area of low pressure across the Gulf will start to work up some light chances of probably rainfall across the southern parts of southeast. Most of that should stay to your south, but again, Ketchikan, Annette, maybe Heidelberg looking at an opportunity for some light precipitation as we get toward the end of the week, and most of the interior again still looking pretty dry. Temperature-wise, readings in the 30s and 40s across southeast today. 41 in Yakutat, 37 in Juneau. Mid-40s there as you head down toward the Dixon entrance. Ketchikan and Annette fairly mild today. Prince William Sound in the lower 30s. Seward was showing 38 today, 31 in Kenai, 27 in Anchorage. Glen Allen was about 2 degrees. Around Healy and Greeley, temps in the teens and 20s. 14 in Fairbanks, 22 in Eagle. Arctic Village was looking at 0, about the same there for Fort Yukon. Anaktuvuk Pass showing 7 above, Barrow 4 above. A little bit further east to Kaktovik, 5 below. Wainwright was 10. Ambler and Bettles are looking at temps in the single digits and teens today. Galena was 19. Kotzebue Sound temperatures in the teens and 20s with reports of some open water about 5 miles offshore of Kotzebue today. 26 degrees around Nome, 28 in St. Lawrence Island, around Grayling, lower 20s for you. McGrath 19. 30s for most of the YK Delta. Bethel was showing 39 degrees by late afternoon, a sign of warmer air working northward. And you can see King Salmon made it up to 42. Dillingham was 37. Kodiak just shy of 40 late this afternoon. 30s for the Alaska Peninsula. Sand Point around 36. Cold Bay and False Pass in the mid-30s. Low 30s for the Pribilofs. 38 Dutch Harbor, Unalaska, and just a hair at or above freezing for the western parts of the chain, including Adak, as you looked at this afternoon's temperatures. Overnight lows then in the lower 30s for the chain and the Alaska Peninsula. Bristol Bay around 32 degrees for the most part. 27 in Nunivak, 20 in St. Lawrence Island. The interior should see temperatures from 10 to about 30 below as you get into Fort Yukon, one of the coldest places there. For southeast, teens and 20s, coastal areas like Sitka and a little bit further south toward the southern entrances, probably mid-30s there, so slightly milder the further south you go. And for south central, mid-20s should do it. Prince William Sound, Cordova should be a little bit closer to 31 degrees. Areas are like Nome, looking at 18 degrees, cold enough for snow again, 8 in Shishmaref, and about the same there. There's 6 in Shishmaref, 8 in Kotzebue. Looking farther north toward the Chukchi Seacoast, single digits there. Wainwright about 2, 6 below in Barrow, and 11 below in Kaktovik, with a high of 1 above tomorrow, 8 above and warming up in Barrow. Kotzebue Sound looking at teens and 20s. Nome 32. You can see the warmth spreading northward now. Lower 30s there around the Yukon Valley and YK. And low to mid 40s, in fact, for Bristol Bay. The Alaska Peninsula back in the mid 40s. Kodiak 41. Southeast looking at highs in the mid to upper 40s. Sitka, Heidelberg likely pushing 50 degrees for your Wednesday. Prince William Sound will see highs above freezing tomorrow. Same goes for Cook Inlet. In fact, some areas Wednesday into Thursday around South Central could be approaching 40 degrees. Fairbanks looking at 19. The Alaska Peninsula and the chain again in the 30s and 40s. Flying weather now, the interior still under severe clear, but any threats for poor visibility will likely be most likely across the west coast, around the Seward Peninsula, and developing along the western parts of the Alaska Range and the windward side of the Kenai Peninsula in this case. That would be Seward up toward Whittier and perhaps into College Fjord, and then south and east of St. Matthew Island and across the southern tip of the Alaska Peninsula. Southeast looks pretty clear, as does most of the eastern Gulf Coast. Let's check your pass conditions though. Anaktuvuk Pass and Adigan Pass appear to be VFR for your Wednesday. For Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, it looks to be an IFR kind of day. Unfortunately, looks like the visibility should be dropping there, as well as areas up toward Rainy Pass. But after that, all the way around the rest of the range, things look to be pretty clear. For Windy Pass, for Isabel Pass, VFR, Mentasta Pass, and Tanita Pass all appear to be VFR conditions for your Wednesday. And Portage Pass should gradually worsen as we go into the afternoon. IFR conditions should develop there, and you should have that for most of the day there, especially on the eastern side if you're flying around western Prince William Sound. Chilkoot and White Pass expected to be VFR. And when you look at the freezing lines, you can see why things are changing out across the west once again. Here's our surface freezing line in white, and here are the elevated freezing levels there in red. Anywhere from 2, 4, 6, even 8,000 feet is overrunning or overshooting that surface freezing boundary. So as we have that warm and wet air coming over, it makes clouds and precipitation and falls down into that colder than freezing air mass at the surface, and making any rain chances there become freezing rain once it hits that cold surface. So again, that's the setup there across the west coast. Icing potential, sure, looks like light to isolated moderate possible across the central and western Gulf, Kenai Peninsula, Kodiak Island, below 13,000 feet, but mainly above 5,000 feet. And then below 13,000 feet, but above 7 for the Alaska Peninsula and into the eastern parts of the Bering Sea, maybe up toward the Bering Strait as well. Most of that, again, just light to isolated moderate. The jet stream shows that ridge stretching all the way from the west coast through the Yukon and into the interior. It seems to be parked just east of Northway at this point. The strongest winds right across the Alaska Peninsula and through the Bering Strait, around 70 to 110 knots. And then our friends in the lower 48 collecting a lot more cold air once again, as that cold air is shunted off from the Arctic and into the Midwest and the East Coast. Several waves out across the North Pacific also telling us that this is an active pattern now, with more unrest there across the storm pattern coming toward Alaska and the West Coast. This will likely change shape here in the next several days. Southeasterly winds coming across the Gulf of Alaska between 30 and 50 knots. High pressure again sitting up across the eastern Brooks Range, helping to channel this stronger southeasterly flow, working in tandem with areas of low pressure across the Bering. There's bound to be some chop across southeast at this point, with opposing winds coming across the southeastern chain. 40-knot winds are mainly along the coast, with varying wind directions and speeds across the peninsula and the chain. Around the Pribilofs, east and southeasterly wind at 25 knots, up to 40 knots over Nome and over Barrow. Look for winds to settle down a little bit as they make the turn in from the north and west. At 3,000 feet, you can see some faster winds moving across south central, southwest, and Kodiak Island between 30 and 60 knots. Low pressure also sitting very close to Unalaska Dutch Harbor, helping to draw in some faster winds and returning those winds in from a north and westerly direction there across the central parts of the chain. Wind speeds across southeast from the southeast at 20 to 30 knots again, with areas in the interior seeing more light and variable flow. In some cases, though, the winds could be as high as 35 knots. So what about turbulence? Generally speaking, there's going to be a broad area of at least occasional moderate across south and west. The western parts of the Alaska Range, south central, Kodiak Island, and southwestern Alaska, probably below 6,000 feet. A much broader area of light to isolated moderate stretching through the interior, probably up toward the western parts of the Brooks Range, the Seward Peninsula, all the way around to the Pribilofs, the eastern Aleutians, and the Alaska Peninsula, with southeast enjoying a relatively clear day, maybe some occasional low-level wind shear through the gaps. The central and eastern interior and a large part of the Arctic coast, a relatively good flying weather day for you tomorrow. That's a look at your aviation forecast. We'll be back with your marine weather here in just a few minutes.
Proximity is how close. How close is the reported weather to the airport? Well, it's assumed to be happening at the airport, so you usually will not see a proximity indicator. Sometimes, however, you will see one. You'll see the abbreviation VC for vicinity. If you have precipitation that is not actually falling on the observer's head, but it is located within 10 miles of the airport, it will be reported as showers in the vicinity. VC for vicinity, SH for showers. You'll know that there's precipitation somewhere between where the observer is standing and 10 miles from the airport. It could actually be on the airport, but it's just not at the observer's position. Now, vicinity means something a little bit different for other weather. Other weather like fog and dust storms and other types of things that are not precipitation have a different rule for vicinity, because here VC for vicinity means occurring between 5 and 10 miles from the center of the airport runway complex. For instance, VCFG, standing for fog in the vicinity, means the fog is occurring not at the airport, but somewhere between 5 and 10 miles from the center of the airport runway complex. Speaking of fog and of mist, there are some restrictions on the use of descriptors. The most significant one of these is that mist, BR, will never be used with a descriptor like shallow or patchy, something like that. So when a descriptor is used to describe fog, fog, FG, will always be used, not mist, regardless of the visibility within the fog. So if you have 3 miles visibility with patchy fog, how is that going to be coded? It's going to be coded 3SM, 3 statute miles visibility, BCFG for patchy fog, bits and chunks of fog, but you will never see BCBR because mist, BR, is never used with a descriptor, the descriptor being the BC for patchy fog. Now, you may have noticed that there is no identifier for ground fog and no descriptor to create it exactly. The best that you can do for ground fog is MIFG, which would be shallow fog. MI for shallow and FG for fog.
Let's talk about a couple rules that'll be helpful in deciphering METARs. You knew we'd talk about rules, didn't you? Actually, these rules will really be helpful. Rule number 1 is you always get the worst news first. That's kind of the way life goes, isn't it? Here's the way they're going to give you the information. First of all, they will tell you about tornadic activity, then thunderstorms, then the present weather in the order of decreasing dominance or importance to the pilot. So it's going from bad to less bad. It's still bad, but going to less bad. Now, they can give you a maximum of 3 groups. Let's take a look at how this might work. First of all, here we have a tornado. By the way, tornadoes are considered to be other weather, but they're reported in the first group when they're observed, and you can see why right here. So here's a tornado. That's the plus FC. And here we have plus TS RAGR. Well, that is a thunderstorm with heavy rain and hail. And then we have a separate group for fog. So other than that, we're having a great day here, and you can see we have a maximum of 3 groups. That's the most that's allowed. Now let's take a look at rule number 2. Rule number 2 says precipitation and obstructions to visibility are always in separate groups. So if you had both some kind of precipitation and some kind of obstruction of visibility, you're going to have at least 2 groups. Here we have light rain and snow and a separate group with the obstruction of visibility. Now, if there is more than one obstruction of visibility, you're going to get yet another group, because if there's more than one obstruction of visibility, they are coded in separate groups. So if we add haze to this, we have yet another group, and now we've got our maximum of 3 groups. Now, other weather is also in a separate group. For instance, if you had squalls, it goes in a separate group like so. Now we've got it all figured out. Let's take a look at our METAR and see if we can make sense out of the weather. And it's very easy. We have thunderstorm with rain, and it's moderate rain and mist. And it's that easy now that we've got it figured out.
And while we are getting warmer across a large part of the southern third, at least, maybe the west coast of Alaska, it doesn't look like we're in for any convective TSRA anytime soon. Here's a look at what we're seeing across southeast. For Wednesday, freezing spray and some gusty northerly winds still coming out of the Lynn Canal. Sustained winds around 35 knots with 7-foot seas. 20-knot winds coming in from the north and east for some of the central inner channels there, and a 20-knot wind with an easterly flow coming in from some of the higher terrain there. So probably some low-level wind shear, and still looking at some gap flow issues there on Wednesday. 4-foot seas in the southern entrances and a broad offshore flow around 20 knots. With 8 to 10-foot seas expected. And again, the higher gusts especially around the Lynn Canal as we go into Wednesday and Thursday. Northerly flow there continues on Thursday. It diminishes somewhat, 15 knots for the other interchannel regions. 3-foot seas expected in most areas. The offshore flow starts to diminish somewhat, around 15 knots, and 8 to 9-foot seas are expected for Thursday in southeast. For south central, some stronger winds there around the Barren Islands, Shelikof Strait area, and Kodiak again. Plenty of rainfall as well. 35 to 40-knot winds will be common across the west part of Alaska, the Gulf of Alaska, and northeasterly winds around Prince William Sound with a 3-foot sea. And northerly flow across the Cook Inlet, again, 5-foot seas in the sea ice-free areas. Northeasterlies coming down the Cook Inlet, ramping up from 35 to 40 knots, and freezing spray still a possibility. That'll diminish somewhat on Thursday. Northerlies still around 15 to 20 knots there, and I should have popped this off here because by this point it should be pretty mild. Northeasterly winds around 10 knots with a 2-foot sea. Easterlies across the western Gulf and a southerly flow on the eastern side of Kodiak. Northeasterlies inside Shelikof Strait with a 5-foot sea. And again, the winds around the Barren Islands should be settling down as we get into Thursday there with a easterly flow coming into Resurrection Bay. Wednesday's marine forecast across the Alaska Peninsula: an east and northeasterly wind on the Bering Sea side, 25 to 35 knots, 20 to 40-knot winds. So on the Pacific side, 16 to 19-foot seas are expected by midweek. As you look at Thursday, the winds completely reverse course as the frontal boundary is working over. An east and southeasterly flow working through Bristol Bay in the Alaska Peninsula region. More of a west flow there south of Sand Point and King Cove, and more of a southeasterly flow coming into Chignik and the western side of Kodiak Island there, with 13 to 15-foot seas on the Pacific side by Thursday. For the Aleutians, northwesterlies coming across the eastern part of the chain, around 30 knots on both sides, 9-foot seas in the north, 13 to 14-foot seas on the south. A west and northwesterly flow for the central chain, 25 knots there, 7-foot seas in the Bering, 11-foot seas on the Pacific side, and lighter westerly flow around 15 knots from Kiska out toward Attu. On Thursday, the winds begin to pump in from the south once again across the central chain, 20 to 35 knots there, with 6 to 10 foot seas from north to south respectively. Easterlies across Kiska, northerlies across Attu at 25 knots with a 7-foot sea, and westerly flow across Nikolsky and Unalaska at 25 knots, 13-foot seas on the Pacific side. Across the west coast, northeasterlies pushing colder air farther and farther south. 6-foot seas around St. Matthew, with the waters opening up enough to give you that sea forecast again. Northerlies around the Pribilofs, a 20-knot flow with 9-foot seas. Easterlies out of Kuskokwim Bay at 35 knots. Those winds diminish and become southeasterly with time on Thursday. Coming over Nunivak Island and around St. Lawrence Island, they become easterly at 30 knots. Southeasterlies over the St. Matthew Island waters and westerlies through the Pribilofs with an 8-foot sea on Thursday. Across the Arctic coast, northeasterlies coming into the Bering Strait, 20 to 30 knots or so, with a westerly flow from Prudhoe Bay out toward Kaktovik, 15 to 20 knots. Watch what happens on Thursday, though. Easterlies out of Kotzebue Sound at 25 knots will keep northeasterly winds off of Cape Lisburne and Point Hope. Now we've got easterly flow strengthening from Kaktovik through Barrow and Wainwright, anywhere from 30 to 40 knots. So a more windy day for sure coming your way on Thursday. Watch for blowing snow. Tonight's forecast shows low pressure working up out of the Gulf, and as it crosses over the Alaska Peninsula, it's dragging with it some pretty warm and wet air. So Kodiak's looking at some locally heavy rainfall tonight. Some of that will work its way into south and western Alaska, but as it does so, the air temperatures there won't warm up quite as quick, and the warm and wet air will overrun that. That means freezing precipitation is possible. And for areas like the Yukon Delta, the lower Yukon Valley, and out around the Bering Strait coast, especially St. Lawrence Island, you're looking at least some freezing rain. So a freezing rain advisory is posted for your area as we head through tonight and tomorrow in some cases. Look for light amounts, generally under 1/10 of an inch. So major interruptions to power shouldn't be much of an issue, but it should probably make things a little bit more difficult to move and travel around. So watch for that, and of course watch for any clear ice there if you're planning to do any flying. Warmer air will pass its way into south central and southwestern Alaska, keeping things pretty clear for southeast in the interior as we go into Wednesday. The focus for most of the precipitation stays either offshore or along the west coast and the chain. As we head into Thursday, precipitation starts to creep into south central Alaska, maybe even in southern parts of southeast for a change, with increasing clouds across the west coast. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
You can tell a lot about a company by where it invests. At ConocoPhillips, we're investing in Arctic science and engineering at the University of Alaska Anchorage. And we're supporting today's students and tomorrow's engineers at UAF. In fact, today, more than 100 of our employees are University of Alaska graduates, and our future is in their hands. We happen to think that's a pretty good investment. ConocoPhillips, Alaska's oil and gas company.